Chapter 22 of Lucinda. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Suitable surroundings. Waldo's was a business letter. Any feelings that might be influencing the proposed transaction, any sentiment that might be involved, whether of Nina's, of his own, of his father's, or of mine, he appeared to consider as having been adequately indicated in our talk at Paris, and accorded them only one passing reference. He assumed that I should be bearing all that — he had a habit of describing the emotions as all that, I remembered — in mind. What remained was to ask me whether I were favorably disposed to the arrangement, the value of his remainder, which must, alas, before many years were out, become an estate in possession, to be fixed by a firm of land agents selected by himself and me, from which price I should suggest deducting 25%, in consideration of what I believe the lawyers call natural love and affection. In other words, because I'd much sooner sell to you than to a stranger. In fact, than to anybody else. The underlining of the last two words clearly asked me to substitute for them a proper name, with which we were both well acquainted. He added that he thought the land's agent valuation would be somewhere in the neighborhood of £30,000, timber included. And so, with kindest remembrances from Nina, who was splendidly fit, considering, another underlining gave me news of possible importance for the future of the Dundrennan barony, he remained my affectionate cousin, though I suspect that son and father at the bottom of their hearts felt much the same about the matter. Sir Paget's letter was expressed in a different vein. Leaving the business to Waldo, he dealt with the personal aspect. You wouldn't believe me if I told you that I hadn't always hoped and expected that the heir of my body and the child of my dear wife should succeed me here. That's nature. But dies aliter visum. The All-Highest herself decides otherwise. I saw in my mind the humorous, rather tired smile with which he wrote that. But I should be an ungrateful churl indeed if I repined at the prospect of being succeeded at Cragsfoot by you, who bear the old name, and, I am told, are to get a handle to it, you who are, and have been always, son of my heart, if not of my body, a loyal, true son too, if you will let me say it. So, if it is to be, I receive it with happiness, and the more you come to your future dominions, while I, brevis dominus, am still here to welcome you, the better I shall be pleased. But, prithee, Julius, remember that you provide in your own person only for the next generation. When your turn comes for the doleful cypresses, what is to happen? You must look to it, my boy. After a touching reference to his old and now lost companion, Aunt Bertha, and to his own loneliness, he went on more lightly. But Waldo comes over every day from Briarmount when they are in residence, and the aforesaid All-Highest herself pays me a state visit once or twice a week. The Queen Regent expects an heir apparent. Oh, confidently. I think she can't quite make out how fate, or nature, or any other deity dared to thwart her last time. I confess I am hypnotized. I, too, have no doubt of the event. So, as to all that, all is calm and confidence. The third peer of the line is on his way. But is there anything wrong in her outlying dominions? Villa San Carlo, though it sounds like a charming winter palace, doesn't seem to have been an unqualified success. Rather tiresome down there, she said. I asked politely after the cousin. Very well, when she had seen him last. But she really didn't know what he was doing. It seemed to her that he was taking a very long holiday from business. Our works down there are of only secondary importance. I remarked that you had written saying how much you were enjoying yourself at Villa San Carlo, and how you regretted being detained in Paris. Oh, he meant to leave us anyhow, I think. I fancied somehow that both of you gentlemen had incurred the royal displeasure. What have you been up to? Rebellion? Lèse majesté? Treason? You are bold men if you defy my Lady Dundrennan. Well, she's probably right in thinking that Cragsfoot is too small for her, and not worth adding to her dominions. Though the purchase would need some contriving. The price that Waldo's letter indicated was not an insuperable difficulty, thanks to the value which Sir Ezekiel was now kind enough to put on my services. I could pay it, and keep up the place on a footing of frugal decency when the time came. For the rest, the prospect was attractive. Cragsfoot had always been an integral part of my life. My orphan childhood had been spent there. If it passed to a stranger, I should feel as if it were dug up by the roots. If I did not fall in with the arrangement, pass to a stranger it would. I felt sure of that. The All-Highest had issued her command. So be it, I said to myself, half in pleasure, still half in resentment at the Dundrannan fiat which broke the direct line of the Rillingtons at Cragsfoot. I also made up my mind to obey Sir Paget's implied invitation as soon as what? The summons from Cragsfoot, the call back to home and home life, my appointment to our London office was now ratified, brought me up against that question. I could answer it only by saying, as soon as Lucinda's affair had somehow settled itself. She could not be left where she was. As a permanency, the present situation was intolerable. She must yield or she must go. Valdez would never let her alone, short of her adopting one of those alternatives. He would keep on at his pestering and posturing. She had no money. Her mother had lived on an annuity or an allowance or something of that kind, which expired with the good lady herself. Clearly, however, she was able to support herself. She must not sell flowers on the piazza all her life. I thought that she would consent to borrow enough money from me to set herself up in a modest way in business, and I determined to make that proposal to her on the morrow, as soon as we had got through the ordeal of this evening's dinner. I fervently hoped that we might get through it without a flare-up between Arsenio and his honored guest, Godfrey Frost. Out of favour at Briarmount, was he, that young man? I could easily have told Sir Paget the reason for that. The only one of the prospective party whom I encountered in the course of the afternoon, though I admit that I haunted the piazza in the hope of seeing Lucinda, was the host himself. I met him in company with a tall, lean-visaged, eminently respectable person, wearing a tall hat and a black frock coat. Arsenio stopped me and introduced me to his companion. He said that Signor Alessandro Panizzi and I ought to know one another. I don't see why, and merely supposed that he was exhibiting his respectable friend, who was, it appeared, one of the leading lawyers in Venice, and indeed an ex-civic of the city. Signor Panizzi, on his part, treated Arsenio with the greatest deference. He referred to him, in the course of our brief conversation, as our noble friend, and was apparently hugely gratified by the familiar, if somewhat lordly, bearing which Arsenio adopted towards him. But, after all, Arsenio was now rich, notoriously so, thanks to the way in which wealth had come to him. One could understand that he might be regarded as a highly to be valued citizen of Venice. Perhaps he was going to run for mayor himself. One more brilliant device to dazzle Lucinda. There it was. In thinking of him, one always expected, one always came back to, the bizarre, the incongruous and ridiculous. It was the overpowering instinct for the dramatic, the theatrical in him, without any taste to guide or to limit it. That was what made it impossible to take him, or his emotions and attitudes, seriously. Waldo's "all that" seemed just the applicable description. I walked away wondering just what particular line his bamboozlement of Signor Alessandro Panizzi might be taking. Moreover, that he could find leisure in his thoughts to posture to somebody else besides Lucinda and myself was reassuring. It made his hints of the night before seem even more unreal and fantastic. That same last word was the only one appropriate to describe what I found happening to my unfortunate salon when I got back early in the evening. Half a dozen men, under the superintendence of Louis and the fat old portier, who lived in a sort of cupboard on the ground floor, opening off the hall, were engaged in transforming it into what they obviously considered to be a scene of splendor. The old portier was rubbing his plump hands in delight. At last Don Arsenio was launching out, spending his money handsomely, doing justice to Palazzo Valdez. The rich English nobleman, this was Godfrey Frost, probably after Arsenio's own description, would undoubtedly be much impressed. Very possibly, but possibly not quite as old Amadeo expected. The table groaned, or at all events I groaned for it, under silver plate and silver candlesticks. The latter were also stuck galore in sconces on the walls. Table and walls were festooned with chains of white flowers. The light bedecked the one handsome thing that really belonged to the room, the antique chandelier in the middle of the ceiling. I had never put lights in it, but they were there now, and the banquet was to be on a scale commensurate with these trappings. Prodigious! Considering the times, absolutely prodigious, Amadeo assured me. He, for his part, could not conceive how Don Arsenio and Signor Louis had contrived to obtain the materials for such a feast. Signor Louis smiled mysteriously. Tricks of the trade were insinuated. It seemed to me that Arsenio had gone stark mad. What were we in for this evening? Just as this thought once again seized on my mind, I saw something that gave me a little start. The butt of a revolver or pistol protruded from the side pocket of Louis's jacket, and the pocket bulged with the rest of the weapon. "What in the world are you carrying that thing about for?" I exclaimed. "Monsieur Valdez told me to clean it," he answered quietly. "He gave it to me for that purpose, out of his bureau." "He didn't tell you to carry it about with you while you did your work, did he?" "No, he didn't," said Arsenio's voice just behind me. The door stood open for the workers, and he had come in his usual quiet fashion. I turned round to find him grinning at me. "Give it here, Louis," he ordered, and slipped the thing into his own pocket. "The room looks fine now, doesn't it?" he asked. "What do you want with your revolver today?" I asked. He looked at me with malicious glee. "Aha, Julius, I did frighten you last night then, after all. You pretended to be very scornful, but I did make an impression. Or else, why do you question me about my revolver?" "I didn't believe a word of that nonsense you hinted at last night," I protested. "But what do you want with your revolver?" "My dear fellow, I don't want to boast of my wealth, but there's a considerable sum of money in my bureau. Very considerable. No harm in being on the safe side, is there?" That seemed reasonable. His manner, too, changed suddenly from derision to a plausible common sense. Possessing a revolver, as most of us who serve do, doesn't mean that one intends to use it, on oneself or on anybody else, does it? I felt at a loss. When he wanted me to believe, I didn't. When he wanted me not to believe, I did. Or at all events half did. With Arsenio, the plausible, sensible explanation was always suspect. To be merely sensible was so contrary to his nature. The busy men had apparently finished their ridiculous work. Louis came in and looked round with a satisfied air. "Splendid, Louis," said Arsenio. "Here, take this thing and put it on the bureau in my room." As Louis obediently took the revolver and left us alone together, Arsenio added to me, "Don't spoil your dinner, a good one, I hope, for these hungry days, by taking seriously anything I said last night. Perhaps in the end I did mean... No, I didn't really. I was wrought up. My friend, wasn't it natural?" Well, it was natural, of course. On a man prone to what Lucinda had called heroics, the hour in which she had given him that kiss, the kiss of farewell as we had both interpreted it to be, would naturally induce them. I should have been disposed to accept his disclaimer of any desperate intentions, except for the fact that somehow he still seemed to be watching me, watching what effect his words had on me, and rather curiously anxious to efface the impression which the sudden appearance of the revolver had made upon me. "Last night, yes." He dropped into a chair. "Her action affected me strangely. It is long since she kissed me, and then to kiss me like that. Can you wonder that I gave way?" He smiled up at me. "One doesn't easily part from Lucinda. Why, you told me that Waldo, our old Waldo, went nearly mad with rage when I took her from him." His brows went up and he smiled. "It needed a European war to save me, you said. Well, if my excitements are not as tremendous as Waldo's, I must admit that they are more frequent. But today I've come to my senses. Pray believe me, my dear Julius, and don't let any absurd notion spoil your dinner." He was very anxious to convince me. My mind obstinately urged the question, was he afraid that I might watch him? That I might interfere with his plan? I tried to shake off the notion, not quite successfully. I had a feeling that heroics might be like strong drink. A man could indulge in a lot of them and yet be master of them, and of himself. But there might come a point where they would gain the mastery and he would be a slave. In which case... "You think this dinner of mine a mad affair?" I found Arsenio saying. "Well, think so, in your stolid English fashion." He shrugged his shoulders scornfully. "You don't see what it means?" "Oh, of course you don't. I suppose you love Lucinda as well." I said, Julius, that you loved Lucinda as well, and the one merit of the English language is that love is a tolerably distinctive word when applied to a woman in that damned black frock. As if she were dressed as her beauty deserves? Well, I don't. I know, we Southerners, how the setting enhances the jewel. By my cunning incitements, you heard, but you had no ears. She will dress herself tonight, you'll see." He waved his hands to embrace the room. "And I have given her suitable surroundings." "I suppose it's about time that we bedecked ourselves," I suggested, rather wearily. "Yes, but one moment." He leant forward in his chair. "What's to become of her, Julius?" I answered him rather fiercely, brutally perhaps. "I think you've lost the right to concern yourself with that." "I have, I know. Hence the occasion of this evening. But you, Julius?" "I shall always be at her service if she needs help. As you know, she's very independent." He nodded his head. Then he smiled his monkey smile. "And there's Godfrey Frost, of course, entirely in a position to assist her. A sound head, a good businessman, wants his price, but... Oh, damn you, go and dress for your infernal dinner." The devil was in him. He got up with a grin. "I doubt whether you'll be very good company. Oh, let's see, where's that revolver? Oh, I gave it back to Louis. So I did. Our esteemed friend ought to be here in half an hour. Do you happen to know that he and Lucinda have been to the Lido together this afternoon? No, you don't? Oh yes, my friend Alessandro and I saw them embarking. Doesn't that fact add a further interest to this evening? But look at the room, the table. Shall we not outshine the Frost millions tonight? You and I, Julius?" "It isn't my affair, thank God." "Oh, that's as it may turn out. Au revoir, then, in half an hour." He succeeded in leaving me in about as bewildered a state of mind as I have ever been in all my life. I, who have often had to decide whether a politician was an honest man or not. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Lucinda by Anthony Hope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Banquet. Since I was not to play host that evening, I decided to let Arsenio be first on the gaudy scene which he had prepared. He should receive the other guests. He should take undivided responsibility for the decorations. I waited until I heard him come down and speak to Louis, and even until I heard, as I very well could in my little bedroom adjoining the salon, Louis announcing first Monsieur Froust, and then... No, it was fat old Amadeo who effected the second announcement, arrogating to himself the rights of an old family servant, that of the most excellent and noble Signora Donna Lucinda Valdez. Thereupon I entered, Amadeo favoring me with no laudatory epithets, but leaving me to content myself with Louis's brief Monsieur Willington. Lucinda was in splendor. She was, as I at least had never before seen her, a grown woman in a grown woman's evening finery. Through all her wanderings she must have dragged this gown about, a relic of her pre-war status. For all I knew, part of the trousseau of the prospective Mrs. Waldo Rillington. But it did not look seriously out of fashion. If I remember right, women dressed on substantially the same lines just before the war as they did in the first months after it. It was a white gown, simple but artistic, of sumptuous material. She wore no ornaments. It was not difficult to conjecture the reason for that. Only her favorite scarlet flower in her fair hair. Yet the effect of her was one of magnificence, of a restrained, tantalizing richness, both of body and of raiment. Whether she had arrayed herself thus in kindness or in cruelty, or in some odd mixture of the two, indulging Arsenio's freak with one hand, while the other buffeted him with a vision of what he had lost, I know not. But a glance at her face showed that her tenderer mood was now past. Arsenio's decorations had done for it. She was looking about her with brows delicately raised, with amusement triumphant on her lips and in her eyes. If Arsenio's frippery had been meant to appeal to anything except her humor, it had failed disastrously. It had driven her back to her scorn, back to her conception of him as a trickster, a mountebank, a creature whose promises meant nothing, whose threats meant less, an amusing ape, and there an end of him. But perhaps the plate and the festoons might impress the third guest, who completed Arsenio's party. Godfrey Frost did not at first sight seem so much as to notice them, to know that they were there. His eyes were all for Lucinda. Small wonder, indeed. But they did not seek or follow her in frank and honest admiration, nor yet in the chivalrous though sorrowful longing of unsuccessful love. There was avidity in them, but also anger and grudge, rancor struggling with desire. He was not looking amiable, the third guest. He set me wondering what had passed on the Lido that afternoon. Arsenio sat down with the air of a man who had done a good day's work, and felt justified in enjoying his dinner and his company. He set Lucinda to his right at the little square table, Godfrey to his left, myself opposite. He gave a glance round the three of us. "Ah, you're amused," he said to Lucinda with his quick reading of faces. "Well, you know my ways by now." His voice sounded good-humored, free from chagrin or disappointment. "And after all, it's my first and last celebration of the bit of luck that number 21 at last brought me." "The first and last bit of luck, too, I expect," she said, but she too was gay and easy. "Yes, I shall back it no more. Its work is done. Not bad champagne, is it, considering? Louis got it somehow. I told you he'd bring luck, Julius. Louis, fill Mr. Frost's glass." He sipped at his own and then went on. "The charm of a long shot, of facing long odds. That's what I've always liked. That's the thing for us gamblers. And who isn't a gambler? Willingly or malgré lui. He who lives gambles. So does he who dies. Except, of course, for the saving rights of the church." "You were a little late with that reservation, Arsenio," I remarked. "You heretics are hardly worthy of it at all," he retorted, smiling. "But to gamble well you must gamble wholeheartedly. No balancing of chances. No cutting the loss. No trying to have it both ways. Don't you agree with me, Frost?" "I don't believe that Mr. Frost agrees with you in the least," Lucinda put in. "He thinks it's quite possible to have it both ways, don't you, Mr. Frost? To win without losing is your idea." He gave her a long look, a reluctant, sour smile. She was bantering him over something known to them, only to be conjectured by Arsenio and me. Something that had passed on the Lido? She had for him a touch of the detached, scornful amusement which Arsenio's decorations had roused in her, but with a sharper tang in it, more bite to less laughter. "I'm not a gambler, though I'm not afraid of a business risk," he answered. She laughed lightly. "A business risk would never have brought the splendor of tonight." She smiled round at the ridiculously festooned walls. We were quickly disposing of an excellent, well-served dinner. Louis was quick and quiet, fat Amadeo more sensible than he looked. Undoubtedly a good cook was in the background. Growing physically very comfortable, I got largely rid of the queer apprehensions which had haunted me. I paid less heed to Arsenio and more to the secret, subtle duel which seemed to be going on between the other two. Arsenio played more with his topic: birth, death, life, love, all gambles into which men and women were involuntarily thrown, with no choice but to play the cards or handle the dice. All true and obvious in a superficial sort of way, but it seemed rather trifling. A mood in which life can be regarded, but one in which few men or women really live it. That he was one of the few himself, however, I was quite prepared to concede, the magnitude of his gains and of his loss as convincing. Louis and Amadeo served us with coffee, and Louis set a decanter of brandy in front of Arsenio. Then they left us alone. Arsenio poured himself out a glass of brandy and handed the decanter around. Holding his glass in his hand, he turned to Lucinda. "Will you drink with me, to show that you forgive my sins?" Her eyes widened a little at the suddenness of the appeal, but she smiled still and answered lightly, "Oh, I'll drink with you." She sipped her brandy. "In memory of old days, Arsenio." "I see," he said, nodding his head at her gravely. She had refused to drink with him on his terms. She would do it only on her own. "Still, you shall forgive," he persisted with one of his cunning smiles. Then he suddenly turned to Godfrey Frost with a change of manner, with a cold malice that I had never seen in him before, a malice with no humor in it, a straightforward viciousness. "Then let us drink together, my friend," he said. "It was with that object that I brought you here tonight. We'll drink together, as we have failed together, Godfrey Frost. A business risk you spoke of just now. It wasn't a bad speculation. A couple of $100 or so. Oh, I had more from your cousin, but her motives were purely charitable, huh? Just a beggarly couple of $100 for a chance at that." A gesture indicated Lucinda. His voice rose. It took on its rhetorical note, and the words fell into harmony with it. "To buy a man's honor and beauty like that for a couple $100. Not a bad risk." Godfrey looked as if he had been suddenly hit in the face. He turned a deep red and leant forward towards his host, his very queer host. He was too shaken up to be ready with a reply. Lucinda sat motionless, apparently aloof from the scene, but a very faint smile was still on her lips. "What the devil's the use of this sort of thing?" I expostulated in a purely conventional spirit, with one's traditional reprobation of scenes. My feelings somehow went no deeper. It seemed then an inevitable thing that these three should have it out before they went their several ways. The conventions were all broken between them. "Because the truth's good for him, and for me, for both of us who trafficked in her." Lucinda suddenly interposed, in a delicate scorn and unsparing truthfulness. "It's only because you've failed yourself that you're angry with him, Arsenio. Let him alone. He's had enough truth from me this afternoon, and a lot of good advice. I told him to go home to Nina Dendраnin. And for heaven's sake, don't talk about trafficking as if you were some kind of social reformer." She turned to me, actually laughing, and I began to laugh too. Well, Godfrey looked absurd, like a dog being whipped by two people at once, not knowing which he most wanted to bite, not sure whether he dared bite either, possibly thinking also of a third whipping which would certainly befall him if he followed Lucinda's good advice. And Arsenio, cruelly let down from his heroics, looked funnily crestfallen too. He was not allowed to be picturesquely, rhetorically indignant. Not with Godfrey, not even with himself. Besides, she added, he did offer to stick to his engagement to lunch with me that day at Simia's. The mock admiration and gratitude with which she recalled this valiant deed, to which she might, in my opinion, well have dedicated a friendlier tone, since it was no slight exploit for him to beard his Nina in that fashion, put a limit to poor Godfrey's tongue-tied endurance. "Yes, you were ready enough to take my lunches, and what else you could get," he sneered. Lucinda gave me just a glance. Here was a business reckoner indeed. Of course he had some right on his side, but he saw his right so carnally. Why couldn't he have told her that they'd been friends, and who could be only a friend to her? That was what I expect he meant in his heart, but his instincts were blunt, and he had been lashed into soreness. Still, though I was feeling for him to that extent, I could not help returning Lucinda's glance with a smile, while Arsenio chuckled in an exasperating fashion. It was small wonder, really, that he pushed back his chair from the table and, looking round at the company, groaned out, "Oh, damn the lot of you!" The simplicity of his retort went home. I felt guilty myself, and Lucinda was touched to remorse, if not to shame. "I told you not to come tonight," she murmured. "I told you that he only wanted to tease you. You'd better go away, perhaps." She looked at him, and his glance obeyed hers instantly. She put out her hand and laid it on one of his for just a moment. "And after all, I did like the lunches. You're quite right there. Arsenio, can't we part friends tonight, since we must part, all of us?" "Oh, as you like," said Arsenio impatiently. A sudden and deep depression seemed to fall upon him. He sat back, staring dejectedly at the table. He reminded one of a comedian whose jokes do not carry. The Banquet was to have been a great grim joke, but it had fallen flat, sunk now into just a wrangle. And at last his buoyant malice failed to lift it, failed him indeed completely. We three men sat in a dull silence. I saw Lucinda's eyes grow dim with tears. Godfrey broke the silence by rising to his feet clumsily, almost with a stumble. I think that he caught his foot in the tablecloth, which hung down almost to the floor. "I'll go," he said. "I'm sorry for all this. I've made a damn fool of myself." Nobody else spoke or rose. If it's any excuse, he almost stumbled in his speech as he had almost stumbled with his feet. "I love Lucinda, and you've used her damnably, Valdez. For what I've done, I pay. For you, go and learn what love is." This, though as recorded, it sounds like his theatrical manner, it was not so delivered. It came from him in a low, dreary voice, as though he were totally dispirited. He glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. It had gone 10 o'clock. He seemed to shiver as he noted the hour. He looked across at me with a helpless appeal in his eyes. He looked like an animal in a trap. A trap bites no less deeply for being of one's own devising. Godfrey was staring at him now in a dull, uncomprehending bewilderment. Lucinda put her elbows on the table and supported her chin in her hands, her eyes set inquiringly on his face. I myself stretched out my hand and clasped one of his, but he shook off my grasp, raised his hands in the air, and let them fall with a thud on the table. All the things on it rattled. Even the heavy plate that he had bought or hired, I don't know which, for his futile banquet. Then he blurted out, in the queerest mixture of justification, excuse, defiance, bravado, "Oh, you don't understand, but to me it means damnation, and I can't do it now. Now the time's come, I can't." There was no doubt about his actual physical shuddering now. Lucinda did not move. She just raised her eyes from where he sat to where Godfrey stood. "You'd better go," she said. "Julius and I must manage this." Her tone was contemptuous still. I got up and took Godfrey's arm. he let me lead him out of the room without resistance, and while I was helping him on with his hat and coat, asked in a bewildered way, "What does it mean?" He meant to go out in a blaze of glory, with a beau jest, but he hasn't got the pluck for it at the finish. That's about the size of it. "My God, what a chap! What a queer chap!" he mumbled, as he began to go downstairs. He turned his head back. "See you tomorrow?" "Lord, I don't know. I've got him to look after. He might find his courage again. I can't leave him alone. Good night." I watched him down to the next landing and then went back towards the salon. I did not think of shutting the outer door behind me. Just on the threshold of the salon I met Arsenio himself in the act of walking out of the room, rather unsteadily. "Where are you going?" I demanded angrily. "Only to get some whiskey. I've a bottle in my room. I want a whiskey and soda." "It's all right. It really is now, old fellow." "I shall come with you." I knew of a certain thing that he had in his own room upstairs and was not going to trust him alone. He shrugged his shoulders slightly, but made no further objection. "We'll be back in a minute," I called out to Lucinda, who was still sitting at the table, her attitude unchanged. Then Arsenio and I passed through the open door and went up the stairs together. As we started on our way, he said, with a curious sputter that was half a sob in his voice, "Lucinda knows me best, and you see she's not afraid. She didn't try to stop me." "She's never believed you meant it at all." "But I did," I answered. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Lucinda by Anthony Hope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mascot. Arsenio opened the door of the apartment with his latchkey and stood aside to let me pass in first. The door of his sitting room, the long, narrow room which I have described before, stood slightly ajar, and a light shone through it. I advanced across the passage, the hall could hardly be called more, and flung the door wide open as I entered, Arsenio following just behind. There in the middle of the room, 2 or 3 paces from the big bureau, one side of which flapped open, showing shelves and drawers, stood Louis, the valet, the waiter from that establishment of Arsenio's at Nice, the seller of the winning ticket, the author of Arsenio's luck. In his left hand he held, clasped against his body, a large black leather portfolio or letter case. In his right was the revolver which his master had given him to clean. He stood quite still, frightened as it seemed into immobility, glaring at us with a terrified face. He had thought that we were safely bestowed round the table downstairs for some time to come. Our footsteps on the stairs had disturbed him when his work was almost finished. Our entrance cut off his retreat. Even if he had had the presence of mind to bar the door, it would have given him only a brief respite. Escape by the window was impossible. But he did not look as if he were capable of reckoning up the situation, or his chances at all. He was numb with fear. "Drop that thing, you scoundrel!" I cried, and it is my belief to this day that he would have obeyed me, put down his weapon, and meekly surrendered if he had been let alone. He was certainly not built for a burglar or for deeds of violence, though I suppose the possession of the revolver had nerved him to this enterprise of his. But Arsenio did not let him alone, or wait to see the effect of my order. Even as I spoke he dashed forward in front of me, uttering a wild cry. It did not sound like fear, either for his money or for his life, or even like rage. Really, it sounded more like triumph than anything else. And he made straight for the armed man, utterly regardless of the weapon that he held. Thus put to it, Louis fired. Once, twice. Arsenio ran, as it were, right on to the first bullet. I had darted forward to support his attempt to rush the thief, if that really was what he had in his mind, and he fell back plump into my arms, just as the second bullet whizzed past my head. Then, with a yell of sheer horror, at what he had done, I suppose, Louis dropped the revolver with a bang on the floor, dropped the fat portfolio too with a flop, and, before I, cumbered with Arsenio's helpless body, could do anything to stop him, bolted out of the room like a scared rabbit. I heard his feet pattering down the stairs at an incredible pace. Arsenio was groaning and clutching at his chest. I supported him to his shabby old sofa and laid him down there. Then I violently rang the bell which communicated with the ground floor where Amadeo abode. The next moment Lucinda came into the room, very quickly but calmly. Did he do it himself, after all? No, Louis. He'd been rifling the bureau and the revolver. Ah, it was Louis that I heard running downstairs. I look after him. Go for a doctor. There were no telephones in the old palazzo. The owner had not spent his precarious gains in that fashion. I thought of sending Amadeo. You'll be quicker. Go, Julius. She knelt down by Arsenio's sofa. As I went on my errand, I knew of a doctor who lived quite close. I met old Amadeo lumbering upstairs, half dressed, and told him what had happened. He looks very bad, I added. Amadeo flung up his hands with pious ejaculations. As I go by the piano nobile, I'll call Father Garcia and take him up with me. Don Arsenio's a good Catholic. Yes, that fact perhaps had something to do with the course which events had ultimately taken that night. When I got back with the doctor, he had gone to bed and kept me waiting. Arsenio had been moved into his bedroom. The priest was still with him, but when he was informed of the doctor's arrival, he came out and Amadeo took the doctor in to the patient, on whom Lucinda was attending. Father Garcia was a tall, imposing old ecclesiastic of Spanish extraction and apparently a friend of the Valdez family, for he spoke of Arsenio without prefix. I have done my office. The doctor can do nothing. Oh, I've seen many men die in a war, and I can tell. He's just conscious, but he can hardly speak. It hurts him to try. Poor Arsenio. His father was a very worthy man, and this poor boy was a good son of the church. For the rest, he shrugged his ample shoulders. He was probably reflecting the opinions of the aristocratic and antiquated coterie which Arsenio had been in the habit of laying under requisitions when he was in Venice. But a curious event, just after his prodigious luck. Father Garcia's eyes bulged rather, and they seemed to grow bulgier still as, between sniffs at a pinch of snuff, he exclaimed slowly, 3,000,000 francs. Donna Lucinda will be rich. The old fellow seemed disposed to gossip. There was nothing else to do while we awaited the verdict. A gamester, I'm afraid, yes. His father feared as much for him, and a good deal of my friends had reason to suspect the same. You're a friend of his, Mr. My name is Rillington, sir, I said. He raised his brows above his bulging eyes. Oh, let me see, wasn't Donna Lucinda herself a Rillington, or am I making a mistake? Only just, said I. I couldn't help smiling. Donna Lucinda all but became a Rillington. Ah, he interrupted. Now I remember the story. Some visitors from London brought it over in the early days of the war. I think they were propaganda agents of your nation, in fact. It was before Italy joined the war. Donna Lucinda's maiden name was Knievet. Her mother and she once rented this very apartment from Arsenio, I believe. Yes, and I think I remember that too. However, he did not seem to remember too much about it, for he went on, and so the romance started, I suppose. She's a very beautiful woman, Mr. Rillington. The expression in his eyes justified my next remark. Whatever else one may say about the poor fellow, he was a devoted lover to his wife, and she was absolutely true to him. I'm old-fashioned enough to think that covers a multitude of sins. She's not, I gather, a Catholic? No, I believe not. A pity, he said meditatively. Whether he was thinking of Lucinda's soul or of her money, I didn't know, and I will forbear from speculating. If he was thinking about the money, it was, of course, only with an eye, a bulging eye, on other people's souls, as well as Lucinda's. Pray, sir, I asked on a sudden impulse. Do you know anything of a friend of Arsenio's here, Signor Alessandro Panizzi? I know what everybody knows, he replied with a sudden fierceness, that he's a pestilent fellow, a radical, a Freemason, an atheist. Was he a friend of Arsenio's? Oh, well, I really don't know. I happened to meet them walking together on the piazza this afternoon, and Arsenio introduced me. And he kept worse company than any of us suspected, the old priest sternly pronounced. If the opinion thus indicated was a just one, Signor Panizzi must be a very bad man indeed. I was just adding hastily that I knew nothing of the man myself. He had looked the acme of respectability, when Lucinda opened the door of the room and beckoned to me. With a low bow to Father Garcia, who was still looking outraged at the thought of Signor Panizzi, I obeyed her summons. He has only a few minutes to live, she whispered hurriedly as we crossed the passage. He seems peaceful in mind and suffers little pain, except when he tries to speak. Still, I'm sure there's something he wants to say to you. I saw it in his eyes when I mentioned your name. He was in bed, partly undressed. The end was obviously very near. The doctor was standing a yard or two from the bed, not attempting any further ministration. I bent over Arsenio, low down, nearly to his pale face, and laid my hand gently on one of his. He did look peaceful, and as he saw me, the ghost of his monkeyish smile formed itself on his lips. He spoke with a groan and an effort. I told you, Julius, that fellow would bring me luck. But you never believed. You never believed in my... His voice choked, his words ended, and his eyes closed. It was only a few minutes more before we left him to the offices of old Amadeo and the old wife whom he summoned from their cupboard of a place on the ground floor. By this time the police were on the scene. There is no need to detail their formalities, though they took some time. The case appeared a simple one, but Lucinda and I were told that we must stay where we were, pending investigations and the arrest and trial of Louis. We knew him by no other name, and knew about him no more than what Arsenio had told me. They let Lucinda retire to her apartment soon after midnight, and me to mine half an hour later. One of them remained on duty in the hall of the palazzo, and, of course, they took that portfolio away with them. In the end, the formalities proved to be just that and no more. 2 days later, a body was found in the Grand Canal, having been in the water apparently about 30 hours. Amadeo and I identified it. The inference was that although Louis had no stomach for fighting, he had that form of courage in which his master had at the last moment failed. It is probable that he was not a good Catholic. I felt indebted to him for the manner of his end. It saved us a great deal of trouble. Poor wretch! I do not believe that he had any more intention of killing Arsenio than I had myself. The knowledge of all that money overcame his cupidity. Perhaps he felt some proprietary right in it. The possession of the revolver probably screwed him up to the enterprise. But the actual shooting was, I dare swear, an instinctive act of self-defense. Arsenio's furious, seemingly exultant rush terrified him. Anyhow, there was an end of him. The Mascot had brought the luck, and, having fulfilled its function, went its appointed way. But by no means yet an end of Don Arsenio Valdez. That remarkable person had prepared posthumous effects, so characteristic of him in their essence, yet so overly characteristic that he seemed to be skillfully burlesquing or travestying himself. In those last days he must have been in a state of excitement almost amounting to lightheadedness. He had seemed barely sane at the banquet, a complete prey to his own vanity and posturing, showing off on the brink of the grave, contriving how to show off even after it had closed over him, and speculating, I do not in the least doubt, how all the business would impress Lucinda. One thing fails to be said about it. he succeeded in stamping it with that vinegary comedy which was the truest hallmark of Monkey Valdez. Quite early on the morning after the catastrophe, if that be the right word to use, I was sitting in my room musing over it and awaiting a summons from Lucinda, when I was favored with a call from that eminently respectable, most pestilent person, Signor Alessandro Panizzi. After elaborate lamentations and eulogies, it would have warmed Arsenio's heart to hear them, and explanations of how he, in his important position, was in close touch with the police authorities, and so heard of everything directly it happened, and consequently had heard of this atrocious crime as soon as he was out of his bed, he approached the object of his visit. I was, he had understood from the deceased gentleman, his confidential friend, also an intimate family friend of Donna Lucinda. Was I aware that Don Arsenio had made a disposition of his property on the afternoon of the very day of his death? A thing which might impress foolish and superstitious people, Signor Panizzi remarked with a sad but superior smile. He himself, as a notary, had drawn up the document, which Don Arsenio had executed in due form. It was in his custody. He produced from his pocket a copy, or rather an abstract, of the operative part of it. To sum up this instrument as briefly as possible, Arsenio bequeathed, first, 10,000 lire to the Reverend Father Garcia, in trust to cause masses to be said for his soul, should Holy Church so permit. It sounded as if Arsenio had his doubts, whether well-founded or not, I do not know, and as things had turned out, immaterial. Secondly, the entire residue of his estate to his wife, the most excellent Signora Donna Lucinda Valdez, his sole surviving near relative. But thirdly, should the said most excellent lady, being already fully provided for, accept only the palazzo, as it was his earnest wish that she should accept it, his ancestral residence, and renounce the inheritance of his personal estate, then, and in that case, he bequeathed the whole of that personal estate to Signor Alessandro Panizzi and two other gentlemen. I forgot their names, but they were both, I subsequently learnt from Father Garcia, pestilent friends of Panizzi's, one may suppose, and naturally pestilent, on a trust to apply the same, in such ways as the law permitted, to the use and benefit of the city of Venice and its inhabitants, which and who were so dear to the heart of the adopted but devoted son of the said city, Arsenio Valdez. "It is prodigious," said Signor Alessandro Panizzi. He handed me the abstract, adding, "You will perhaps like to show it to the excellent lady?" He paused. "It is, of course, a question what course she will adopt. The sum is a large one, I understand." The anxiety that showed itself in his voice was natural and creditable to a Venetian patriot, and quite intelligible too in a gentleman who saw himself with the chance of handling an important public trust. There would be kudos to be got out of that, but I did not pay much attention to his anxiety. "You're right, it is prodigious," I said, smiling broadly in spite of myself. How Arsenio must have enjoyed giving those instructions. No wonder he had looked complacent when I met him with Panizzi on the piazza. And no wonder that Panizzi had been so deferential. A foretaste for Arsenio of the posthumous praise which he was engineering. The talk of him after his death, the speculation about him. Because, of course, he was quite safe with Lucinda, and he knew it. He was obliged, I believe, though I do not profess to know the law, to leave her part of his property, but it was handsome, more gallant, and chivalrous to give it all to her, in the sure and certain knowledge that she would not take the money brought by the winning ticket. And next to her in his heart came his dear city of Venice, if not beloved Lucinda, then beloved Venice, the two queens of his heart. What a fine flourish! What an exit for himself he had prepared! The plaudits would sound loud, and long after he had left the stage. It is of course possible, I found Signor Panizzi saying, that our lamented friend had discussed the matter with his wife and that they had... Well, that's not at all unlikely. You'd like me to tell her about this? It would no doubt be convenient to have as soon as possible an indication of her... Naturally, I'll speak to her and let you know her views as soon as possible. It is a large sum, as you say. She may desire to take time for consideration. I knew that she would not take 5 minutes. I may tell you, without breach of confidence, I think, that our lamented friend was at first disposed to confine his benefaction, in the event of its becoming operative by his wife's renunciation, to distinctly ecclesiastical charities. I allowed myself the liberty, the honor, of suggesting to him a wider scope. Why be sectional, I suggested. The gratitude, the remembrance of all your fellow citizens, that would be a greater thing, Don Arsenio, I permitted myself to say, and the idea appealed to him. Really then, I remarked, Venice is hardly less indebted to you, Venice as a whole, I mean, than to poor Arsenio himself. No, no, I couldn't allow that to be said, but I'm proud if I in any way had a humble... Exactly, and if it comes out, and surely, why shouldn't it, everybody will be very grateful to you, except perhaps the distinctly ecclesiastical charities. By the way, do you know this Father Garcia? He's living in this house on the first floor, and we called him in to see Arsenio. Last night, before he died. I don't know Father Garcia personally, he said stiffly, but very well by repute. He paused. I waited to see what he would say of Father Garcia. An utter reactionary. A black reactionary, and none too good an Italian. He lowered his voice and whispered, strongly suspected of Austrian sympathies. I see, I replied gravely. He had almost got even with the old priest's pestilent. He rose and bade me a ceremonious farewell. As he went out, he said, this bequest, and whether it comes into operation or not, it must receive publicity coming from a member of the old reactionary nobility, from a Spanish Catholic, may well be considered to mark a stage in the growing solidarity of Italy. That seemed as much as even Arsenio himself could have expected of it. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Lucinda by Anthony Hope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Homage. Lucinda's mental idiosyncrasy resisted any attempt at idealization, for all that she had accused me of making the attempt. Though she would not persist in cruelty, and would remove herself from the temptation to it when once she had realized what it was, yet she could be, and had been, cruel. In like manner, she could be hard and callous, very inaccessible to sentimentality, to the obvious appeal to the emotions which takes its strength from our common humanity with its common incidents, its battle, murder, and sudden death, and so on. She did not accept these things at their face value, or in what one may call their universal aspect. In her inner mind, she was not very articulate, or at all theoretical, about it, but in her inner mind she seemed to revalue each of such incidents by an individual and personal standard which, in its coolness and intellectual detachment, certainly approached what most of us good human creatures, so ready to cry as we are so ready to laugh, would call a degree of callousness. There was a considerable clear-sightedness in this disposition of hers, but also fully that amount of error, which, as I suppose, our own personality always introduces into our judgments of people. We see them through our own spectacles, which sometimes harden and sometimes soften the outlines of the objects regarded, among which is included the wearer of the spectacles. She had loved Arsenio once. She had cleaved unto him with a fidelity to which, in these days, her own word primitive must be allowed to be the most obviously applicable. Remorse had smitten her over her cruelty to him. All the same, in a measure she erred about him, judging his love solely by the standard of his conduct, his romance in the light of its frivolity and shamelessness, his sensibility by its failure adequately to understand a subtle and specialized sensibility in herself. That, at least, was the attitude to which her years of association with him, now intimate, now distant and aloof, had brought her. It was not, of course, to be attributed to anything like its entirety to the girl whom he had kissed at Cragsfoot, or whom he had loved at Venice, or carried off from Waldo. Her final judgment of him was the result of what is called, in quite another connection, a progressive revelation. Thus it happened that his tragic death was, to put it moderately, no more tragic to her than it was to me, his friend rather by circumstances than choice or taste, by interest and amusement more than by affection. She took him at his word, so to say, and accepted the note of ironical comedy which he himself was responsible for importing into the occurrence. Keen-eyed for that aspect, and in a bitter way keenly appreciative of it, she was blind to any other, and indeed reluctant to try to see it, almost afraid that even dead he might befool her again, still irremediably suspicious that he was deceiving her by lies and posturings. As a result, she was really and truly in the depths of her soul unmoved by the catastrophe, and not unamused by the trappings with which Arsenio had bedraped it, or rather his previously rehearsed but never actually presented version of it. For the outside observer, comparatively outside anyhow, and for the amateur of comedy and its material, human foibles, prejudices, ambitions, there was amusement to be had. As soon as Lucinda's decision to renounce the inheritance, except the palazzo, which, as she observed to me, had been honestly come by, and honestly preserved by being let out in lodgings, Arsenio's last will and testament became an animated topic of the day, and a rather controversial one. The clericals and their journals, Signor Panizzi's black reactionaries and pro-Austrians, paid lip service to the 10,000 lire for masses, but could not refrain from some surprise at the choice of trustees which the lamented Don Arsenio, a good Catholic and of old noble stock, had made. The trustees were all pestilent, as I had suspected, while the other side, the patriots, the enlightened, the radicals, the pestilents, while most gratefully acknowledging his munificence and belauding the eminent gentlemen to whom he had confided his trust, pointed out with satisfaction how the spirit of progress and enlightenment had proved too strong in the end, even for a man of Don Arsenio's clerical antecedents and proclivities. As for Signor Panizzi, both sides agreed that his finger had been in the pie. His position as first and dominating trustee was for one a formidable menace to, and for the other a significant guarantee of, a wise, beneficial, and honest administration of the fund. Under the spur of this public interest and discussion, Don Arsenio's funeral assumed considerable dimensions, and was, in fact, quite an affair, with a sprinkling of blacks, a larger sprinkling of pestilents, a big crowd of curious Venetian citizens, a religious service of much pomp conducted by Father Garcia, followed at the graveside, the priests and the blacks having withdrawn with significant ceremony, by a fiery panegyric from Signor Panizzi. Altogether, when I next go to Venice, I shall not be surprised to see a statue of Arsenio there. I hope that the image will wear a smile on its face, a smile of his old variety. Lucinda did not attend the ceremony. It would have been too much for her feelings, for some of her feelings at all events. But to my surprise I saw Godfrey Frost there. I had been thrust, against my will, into the position of one of the chief mourners. He kept himself more in the background, and did not join me until after the affair was finished. Then we extricated ourselves from the crowd as soon as we could, and made our way back together, ending up by sitting down to a cup of coffee on the piazza. I had seen and heard nothing of him since his disordered exit from my apartment just before the catastrophe. I had indeed been inclined to conclude that he had left Venice and, not thinking that his condolences would be well received, had left none behind him. But here he was, and in a gloomy and disgruntled state of mind, as it seemed. He had been thinking things over, no doubt, with the natural conclusion that he had not got much profit or pleasure out of the whole business, out of that acquaintance with the Valdezes, which he had once pursued so ardently. I didn't choose to seem to run away, he told me, in case there was any investigation or a trial or anything of that kind. Besides, he added this rather reluctantly, I had a curiosity to see the last of the fellow. But they tell me I shan't be wanted, as things have turned out, and I'm off tomorrow. Going home, Julius. There was evidently more that he wanted to say. I smoked in silence. I don't want to see Lucinda, Madame Valdez, he blurted out, after a pause. But I wish you'd just say that I'm sorry if I annoyed her. I've made a fool of myself. I'm pretty good at business, but a fool outside it. So far, at least. I don't understand what she was up to, but, well, I'm willing to suppose... I helped him out. You're willing to give a lady the benefit of the doubt? It's usual, you know. I've very little doubt that she'll make friends with you now, if you like. He turned to me with a smile, rather sour, yet shrewd. Would you think that good enough yourself? At first, I thought that he was questioning me as to the state of my own affections. But the words which he immediately added, in a more precise definition of his question, showed me that he was occupied with his own more important case. In my place, situated as I am, you know, as a result of shock or of meditation thereupon, or of contemplation of the lamentable life and death of Arsenio Valdez, Mr. Godfrey Frost was becoming himself again. I do not think that the Wesleyan strain had anything to do with the matter at this stage. It was the Frost business instinct that had revived, the business view. Godfrey might have counted the world well lost for Lucinda's love, at all events well risked, business risked, so to put it, but not for the mere friendship, the hope of which I had held out to him. In my place, situated as I am, the phrases carried a good deal to me, a tremendous lot to him. The world, such a world as his, was not to be lost or bartered for less than a full recompense. After all, whoever did talk of losing his world for friendship? Most people think themselves meritorious if they lose £100 on that score, and Godfrey had, in all likelihood, the precise figures were unknown, already dropped a good deal more than that, and had taken in return little but hard words and buffeting. No wonder the Frost instinct looked suspiciously at any further venture. Not of actual money, of course. That stood only as a symbol, and to be even an adequate symbol would have required immense multiplication. If a symbol were to be used in any seriousness, the old one served best, the old personification of all that he, in an hour of urgent impulse, had been willing to lose or to risk for Lucinda. Well, my dear fellow, I said urbanely, there were always circumstances, to which we needn't refer in detail, that made any intimate acquaintance between you and the Valdezes, well, difficult. Affectation to deny it. I've even felt it myself, of course in a minor degree. Why a minor degree? He said rather aggressively. If I'm Nina's cousin, you're Waldo's. There's all the difference, I said decisively, though I was not at all prepared to put the difference into words. However, I made a weak and conventional effort. Old Waldo's so happy now that he can't bear any malice. He cut across the lame inadequacy of this explanation. Not that there wasn't a bit of truth in it. I'm damned rich, he observed moodily, and everybody behaves to me as if I was damned important. Except you and the Valdezes, of course. But I'm not free. Let's have a liqueur to wash down that coffee, shall we? I agreed, and we had one. It was not a moment to refuse him creature comforts. "I'm part of the concern," he resumed after a large sip, "and jolly lucky to be, of course, I see that. But it limits what one may call one's independence. It doesn't matter a hang what you do, Julius." This to me, London representative of Colston's? "Oh, privately, I mean, of course. But with me, private life, well, family life, I mean, and business are so infernally mixed up together. Nina can't possibly give me the sack, but it would be infernally inconvenient not to be on terms with her." He paused and added impressively, "It might, in the end, break up the business." "One might as well think of breaking up the Great Pyramid, or Mount Popocatepetl. Too large an order, even for an age of revolution." "But you and Nina have nothing to quarrel about," I expostulated dishonestly. He eyed me, again smiling sourly. "Oh, come, you know better than that," his smile said, though his tongue didn't. "And besides, it would upset that idea that she and I talked over and that rather particularly attracted me. I think I spoke to you about it, about Cragsfoot, you know." "Have you heard from Lady Dundrennan lately?" "No, not since I'd left the villa." He made this admission rather sulkily. "Ah, then you're not up to date. Cragsfoot's all arranged. I'm to have it." And I told him about the family arrangement. Here I must confess to a bit of malicious triumph. The thing envisaged itself to me as a fight between Rillington and Frost, and Rillington had won. Waldo's old allegiance had resisted complete absorption. But my feeling was, at the moment, rather ungenerous. He was a good deal humbled already. He took the disappointment very well. "Well, it was a fancy of mine, but of course you ought to have the first call, if Waldo sells out. So you'll be living at Cragsfoot after Sir Paget's death." He appeared to ruminate over this prospect. "Yes, and I hope to be there a good deal of my time even before that." "With Nina and Waldo for your neighbors at Briarmount?" "Of course, why not? What do you mean? I shall see you there too sometimes, I hope." "I hope you'll get on well with her." He was smiling still, though in a moody, malicious way, as one is apt to smile when contemplating the difficulties or vexations of others. "You and your family," he added the next moment, and with that he rose from his chair. "No good asking you to dine tonight, I suppose?" I shook my head. "No, you'll have to be on hand, of course. Well, goodbye then. I'm off early tomorrow." He held out his hand. "It'll interest Nina to hear about all this." He waved his hand round Venice, but no doubt he referred especially to the death and burial of the eminent Don Arsenio Valdez. "Pray give her my best regards. Pave the way for me as a neighbor, Godfrey." "Taking everything together, it'll need a bit of smoothing, perhaps." He nodded to me and strolled away from the piazza. His words had given me material for a half-amused, half-scared reflection. The mood which the neighborhood of Lady Dundrennan, and much more, the possibility of any conflict with Lady Dundrennan, always aroused in me. Sir Paget's letter had reflected, in a humour slightly spiced with restiveness, the present relations between Cragsfoot and Briarmount. What would they be with me in residence, and presently in possession? With me and my family there, as Godfrey Frost said. My family which did not exist at present. But I did not sit there reflecting. I paid for our refreshments. Godfrey, in his preoccupation, had omitted even the offer to do so, and went back to the palazzo. Old Amadeo waylaid me in the hall and told me that Donna Lucinda had requested me to pay her a visit as soon as I returned from the funeral. But he prevented me from obeying her invitation for a few minutes. He was in a state of exultation that had to find expression. "Oh, what a funeral! You saw me there? No? But I was, of course. A triumph. The name of Valdez will stand high in Venice henceforth. Oh, I don't like Panizzi and that lot any more than Father Garcia does. My sympathies are clerical. None the less, it was remarkable. Alas, what wouldn't Don Arsenio have done if he hadn't been cut off in his youth? That was a question which I felt, and feel, quite incapable of answering, save in the most general and non-committal terms. Something astonishing, I said with a nod, as I dodged past the broad barrier of Amadeo's figure and succeeded in reaching the staircase. Right up to the top of the tall old house I had to go this time, past Father Garcia and his noble black friends, past the scene of the banquet and the scene of the catastrophe. I think that Lucinda must have been listening for my steps. She opened the door herself before I had time to knock on it. She was back in the needlewoman's costume now, her black frock with her shawl about her shoulders. Perhaps this attire solved the problem of mourning in the easiest way, or perhaps it was a declaration of her intentions. I did not wait to ask myself that. The expression of her face caught my immediate attention. It was one of irrepressible amusement, of the eager amusement which seeks to share itself with another appreciative soul. She caught me by the hand and drew me in, leading me through the narrow passage to the door of her sitting room, much of a replica of Arsenio's on the floor below, though the ceiling was less lofty and the windows narrower. Then I saw what had evoked the expression on her face. Between the windows, propped up against the discolored old hangings on the wall, stood the largest wreath of immortelles which I have ever seen on or off a grave, in or out of a shop window. And occupying about half of the interior of the circle, there was a shield or plaque of purple velvet, oh, very sumptuous, bearing an inscription in large letters of gold. To the illustrious Donna Lucinda Valdez, and to the immortal memory of the illustrious Senor Don Arsenio Valdez, the city and citizens of Venice offer gratitude and homage. Isn't it tremendous? Whispered Lucinda, her arm now in mine. It certainly is some size, I admitted, eyeing the creation ruefully. No, the whole thing. I mean Arsenio himself. Oh, how I should like to tell them the truth. The funeral, too, was tremendous, I remarked. But I suppose Amadeo has told you. Yes, he has. Also Father Garcia, who paid me a visit of condolence. And a number of Arsenio's noble friends have sent condolences by stately, seedy manservants. Oh, and those trustees have left their cards, of course. Panizzi and the others. All this time we had been standing arm in arm opposite the portentous monument of grief, gratitude, and homage. Now Lucinda withdrew her hand from my arm and sank into a chair. I'm having fame thrust upon me. I'm being immortalized. The munificent widow of the munificent Arsenio Valdez. I'm becoming a public character. Oh, he is having his revenge on me, isn't he, Julius? I can't stand it. I must fly from Venice. My attention stuck on the monstrous wreath. What are you going to do with that? I wonder if there would ever be a dark enough night to tie a flat iron to it, steal out with it round our necks, and drop it in the Grand Canal, Lucinda speculated wistfully. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Lucinda by Anthony Hope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Air on the Coast. And did a dark enough night ever come, Julius? Sir Paget asked with a chuckle. It was late summer. I had arrived that day to pay him a visit and incidentally to complete the transaction by which Waldo was to convey to me the reversion to Cragsfoot. My uncle and I sat late together after dinner, while I regaled him with the story of the last days of Arsenio Valdez, of his luck, his death, and his glorification. Alas, sir, such things can't actually happen in this world. They're dreams, platonic ideas laid up in heaven, inward dispositions towards things which can't be literally translated into action. We did it in our souls. But no, The wreath doesn't, in bare and naked fact, lie at the bottom of the Grand Canal. It hangs proudly in the hall of Palazzo Valdez, the apple of his eye to fat old Amadeo, with whom Lucinda left it in charge, a pledge never likely to be demanded back, when she leased the palazzo to him. He undertakes the upkeep and expenses, pays her about $200 a year for it, and expects to do very well by letting out the apartments. He considers that the wreath will add prestige to the place and enhance its letting value. Besides, he's genuinely very proud of it, and the Valdez legend loses nothing in his hands, I assure you. It's a queer story, and that's the end of it, is it? Because it's nearly 6 months since our friend the monkey, as you boys used to call him, played his last throw and won. There's very little more to tell. As you know, Sir Ezekiel's death sent me on my travels once again, to the States and South America. I was appointed managing director and had to go inspecting and reorganizing and so forth. That's all settled. I'm established now in town, and here, thank God, I am at old Cragsfoot again. You've certainly been a good deal mixed up in the affair, by fate or choice, he said, smiling. But you're not the hero, are you? Arsenio claims that role. Or the heroine. What of her, Julius? She came back to England 4 or 5 months ago. She's living in rooms at Hampstead. She's got the palazzo rent, and she still does her needlework. She gets along pretty comfortably. You've seen her since you came back, I suppose? Yes, pretty nearly every day, I answered. She was the first person I went to see when I got back to London. She was the last person I saw before I left London this morning. He sat rubbing his hands together and looking into the bright fire of logs that his old body found pleasant now, even on summer evenings. The wind blows cold off the sea very often at Cragsfoot. You're telling me the end of the story now, aren't you, Julius? Yes, I hope and think so. Indeed, why shouldn't I say that I know it? I think that we both knew from the hour of Arsenio's death. We had been too much together, too close in spirit through it all, for anything else. How could we say goodbye and go our separate ways after all that? It would have seemed to us both utterly unnatural. First, my head had grown full of her, in those talks at St. Maxime that I told you we'd had. And when a woman's concerned, the heart's apt to follow the head, isn't it? I don't wonder at either head or heart. She was a delightful child. She seems to have grown into a beautiful woman. Yes, she would have. And one that might make a man think about her. There was nothing between you while he lived. No, I don't ask that question. I've no right to. And I think no need to. With her, there couldn't have been. It was as impossible as it proved in the end for her to marry Waldo. For her, it was a virtue in me that I knew it. She wasn't married to Arsenio Valdez when she ran away from Waldo. In her own eyes, she was. And when he called her back, well, she had to go. Ah, I've sometimes fancied that there might have been some untold history like that. She now wishes that you and Waldo, just you two, should know that there was. Will you tell him, sir? I'd rather not. She thinks it may make you and him feel more gently to her. She's proud herself, you know, and was sorry to wound others in their pride. It's generous of her. I'll tell him what I must, and you need tell me no more than you have. I shouldn't wonder if the idea isn't quite new to him either. There are quarters from which something of the sort may have been suggested, eh, Julius? I know nothing as to that, but as you say, it's very possible. You'll have gathered how the feelings of these two ladies towards one another runs through the whole business. And we're not finished with them yet. Before Waldo sets his hand to that agreement, he must know that the agreement which is to bring me to Cragsfoot will bring Lucinda there too. Yes, as its mistress. Even in my lifetime, if she so pleases. After me, in any case. He looked across to me, smiling. And the moment so difficult. The more difficult, because it's otherwise so triumphant. The heir apparent is born, a month ago. I wrote you about it. The dynasty is assured. Her Majesty is at her grandest and, I will add, her most gracious. I saw her about again for the first time the day before yesterday, and she said to me, 'Now I'm really content, Sir Paget,' implying, as it seemed to me, that the subject world ought to be content also. All the court was there, the heir itself, the dear old prince consort, the Grand Vizier. Forgive me mixing East and West, but that seems to be the sort of position which she assigns to young Godfrey Frost, an exalted but precarious position, with a throne on one hand and a bowstring on the other. Oh yes, and there was a lady-in-waiting into the bargain, a pretty girl called Eunice something or other." "Oh yes, she was at Villa San Carlo, Eunice Unthank," said I, smiling. "Nina, pertinacious as a limpet." "And now we're to come breaking in on this benevolent despotism. Our schemes border on conspiracy, don't they?" He grew graver, though he still smiled whimsically. "A reconciliation possible?" he suggested doubtfully. I laughed. "There's a crowning task for your diplomacy, Sir Paget. If I could change the hearts of women, I should be a wizard, not a diplomatist. Their feuds have a grand implacability beside which the quarrels of nations are trivial and transient affairs. In this matter, I'm a broken reed. Don't lean upon me, Julius. And could you answer for your side? For your fair belligerent?" "Lucinda makes war by laughing," said I, laughing myself. "But, well, I think she would go on laughing, you know." "Just what my Lady Dundrennan always hates, and occasionally suspects, even in me." "I wish to blazes that Waldo would have one of his old rages and tell her it's not her business." "I dare say he may wish you hadn't taken so much interest in his runaway fiancée," was Sir Paget's pertinent retort. "No, he'll have no rages. Like you, I sometimes regret it. If she vetoes, he'll submit." He shook his head. "Here are we poor men up against these grand implacabilities. They transcend our understanding and mock our efforts. Even Arsenio, the great Arsenio, though he made use of them, tripped up over them in the end. What can you and I and poor Waldo do?" He got up. "I'll write a line to Waldo on the point, on the 2 points, tonight, and send it up by the car tomorrow. He can let us know his answer before Stannard is due here with the deeds in the afternoon. There might even be time to telephone and stop him from starting, if the answer's a veto." Diplomatist though Sir Paget was, man of affairs as I must assume myself to be, or where stands the firm of Colston's, our judgments were clumsy, our insight at fault. We did no justice to the fine quality of Lady Dundrennan's pride. It was not to be outdone by the pride of the needlewoman of Simiez, outwardly at all events, and did not many tell us that wholly to conquer or even conceal such emotions as fear and self-distrust is a moral triumph, where not to feel them is a mere fluke of nature, just the way one happens to be concocted? The only answer that came to Sir Paget's no doubt very delicately, diplomatically expressed note came over the telephone. Sir Paget had not trusted its secrecy. From butler to butler, Marsden at Briar Mount told Critcher at Cragsfoot that he was to inform Sir Paget that Colonel Rillington said it was all right about this afternoon. Critcher delivered the message as Sir Paget and I were sitting in the garden before lunch, on that bench by the garden door, whereon Lucinda had once sat listening fearfully to the quarrel of angry youths. "Very well, Critcher," said Sir Paget indifferently. But when the man had gone, he turned to me and said, with a tremor in his voice, "So you can come, you see, you and Lucinda, Julius." I had not known till then how much he wanted us. I say, what would poor old Aunt Bertha have said? She went over, tea and baggage. "She'd have come back with the same impedimenta," I declared, laughing. There was a stateliness in Lady Dundrennan's assent, given by her presence and countenance to the arrangement which the allied family of the Rillingtons had, well, I suppose Waldo had, submitted to her approval. The big Briarmount car, even bigger, more newly yellow than the car of Simia's, brought down the whole bunch, all the court, as Sir Paget had called it. Briarmount's approval was almost overwhelmingly signified. Godfrey, at least, wore an embarrassed air, which the ostensible character of the occasion did not warrant. And little Lady Eunice, I suspected that the information had filtered down to her through the other three of them, seemed to look at me with something of the reproachful admiration one reserves for a daredevil. Waldo, for his part, gave my hand a hard, though surreptitious squeeze, smiling into my eyes with his old kindness, somehow conveying an immense deal to me about how he, for his part, felt about the implacabilities and the way they had affected his life, and now mine. Of course, I was myself in the mood to perceive, to exaggerate, or even to imagine such thoughts in him. But there it was. His eyes traveled from my face to his lady's shapely back. She was putting Mr. Stannard the lawyer at his ease. He was a cadet of an old county family, and one of the best-known sportsmen in the neighborhood. And back to my face again, and, well, certainly the situation was not lost on Waldo. But it was only after our business was finished, a short recital of the effects of the deeds from Stannard. Didn't we know more than he did about that? But no doubt it was proper. And then the signatures, Dundrennan witnessing in a fine, bold, decisive hand, that he said a word to me. God give you and yours happiness with the old place, Julius. The pang of parting from it spoke there, as well as kindliness and forgiveness for us. Sir Paget insisted, certainly not to the displeasure of Mr. Stannard, on wetting the signatures with a bottle of his Pommery 1900. Nina just wetted her lips. Even to that vintage she could condescend. Then we all strolled out into the garden while tea was preparing. There was the old place, the high cliffs above it, one narrow wooded ledge fronting the sea, scant acres, but, as it were, with all our blood in them. I felt like a usurper, in spite of the honest money that I was paying, the younger branch ousting the elder, even through an abdication. But I was a usurper happy and content, as I dare say they often are, in spite of the poets and the dramatists. Sir Paget and Stannard paired off, Godfrey and Eunice. Waldo sat down on the bench by the door and lit his pipe. I found myself left with Nina Dundrennan. With the slightest motion of her hand, she invited me to accompany her along the walk towards the shrubbery. At once I knew that she meant to say something to me, though I had not the least idea on what lines her speech might run. She could be very candid. Had she not been once, long ago, she, the skeleton at the feast? She could also put the truth very decisively in its proper place, a remote one. Fires burnt in her, I knew that, but who could tell when the flames would show? There was a seat placed where a gap in the trees gave a view of the sea. Here we sat down together. With her usual resoluteness, she began at once with what she had made up her mind to say. Waldo didn't show me Sir Paget's note, but he told me a piece of news about you which it gave him. He gave me to understand that you and Sir Paget thought that I, as well as he himself, should know it. He told me that the arrangement was no longer repugnant to his own feelings, though it once would have been. He felt both able and willing to ignore the past and start afresh on terms of friendship with Madame Valdez, with Lucinda. He asked me what my feelings were. I said that in my view that was hardly the question. I had married into the Rillington family. Any lady whom Sir Paget and he, the heads of the family, were prepared to accept and welcome as a member of it, would, as a matter of course, be accepted by me. I should treat her, whenever we met, with courtesy, as I should no doubt be treated by her. A great degree of affection, I reminded Waldo, was not essential or invariable between the relations in law. Here Lady Dundrennan smiled for a moment. Least of all should I desire that any supposed feelings of mine should interfere with the family arrangement about Cragsfoot which you all three felt to be desirable. the more so as it had in a way originated with myself, since if I had wished to make this place our principal residence, the present plan would never have been thought of at all. So I told him to put me entirely out of the question. He should be quite safe in feeling sure that I should accept the situation with a good grace. She paused, and I took occasion to say, I think we're all much indebted to you, and myself most of all. Any other attitude on your part would have upset an arrangement which I have come to have very much at heart. I am grateful to you, Nina. You know a great deal. Indeed, you probably know pretty well everything that has happened between Lucinda and me. You wouldn't defend all that she did. I don't defend all I did. When I'm challenged, I fight, and I suppose Jonathan Frost's daughter isn't dainty as to her weapons. That's your point of view about me anyhow, isn't it? You've always been in her camp. You've always been a critic of me. Really, I've regretted the whole, difficulty and, well, difference very much. You've laughed at it even more than you've regretted it, I think, she remarked dryly. But I've liked you better than you've liked me, though you did laugh at me, and I'm not going to make things difficult or uncomfortable for you. When I accept a state of things, I accept it without reservation. I don't want to go on digging pins in. If I have ever smiled, as you accuse me of having done, as well as regretted, it was because I saw your qualities as well as hers. The battle was well joined. You've both had your defeats and your victories. I should like you to be friends now. Yes, I believe you would. That's why I'm talking like this to you. But, her voice took on a sudden ring of strong feeling, it's impossible. There are such memories between us. I did not urge the point. It would be useless with her, very likely also with Lucinda. I let it go with a shrug. She sat for a moment in the stately composed silence that so well became her. It's probable that we shall divide our time mainly between London, Dundrennan, and Villa San Carlo in future. It's even likely that if Godfrey settles matters with Eunice Unthank, as I think he will, he'll take a lease of Briarmount. That would not be disagreeable to you, would it? Not the least in the world, I answered, smiling. I like them both very much. She turned to me with a bland and simple sincerity of manner. The doctor thinks that the air on this coast is too strong for baby. I seemed to be hearing an official bulletin, or communiqué, as for some occult reason, or pure love of jargon, they used to call it. There was no question of a reverse at the hands of the enemy, but climatic conditions rendered further operations undesirable. The withdrawal was being effected voluntarily, in perfect order, and without loss. That the enemy was taking possession of the evacuated territory was a circumstance of no military significance whatever, though, to be sure, it might make some little difference to the inhabitants. It won't do to run any risks with that precious boy, I observed with an approving smile, and, as I flatter myself, with just the artistic shade of jocosity, as if I were gently chaffing her on a genuine but exaggerated maternal solicitude. Well, when the doctor says that, what can one do? Asked Lady Dundrennan. Oh, one must follow his advice, of course, I murmured, with a nod of my head. The bark of our conversation, another metaphor may well be employed to illustrate her skill, being thus piloted through the shoals of truth into the calm deep waters of humbug, its voyage ended prosperously. I should never forgive myself, and Waldo would never forgive me if I took the slightest risk, Nina concluded as she rose from the seat. But as we stood there facing one another, before we began to stroll back to the house, as we stood facing one another all alone, we allowed ourselves one little relapse into reality. Do you think of being off soon? I asked with a smile. She gave me one sharp glance and a contemptuous smile. Before your wedding, whenever that may be, Julius. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Lucinda by Anthony Hope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. In 5 years. Winter had set in again when Lucinda and I came together to Cragsfoot. The picture of her on her first evening there stands out vivid in my memory. Sir Paget had received her with affectionate, but perhaps somewhat ceremonious courtesy. There was a touch of ratifying a treaty of peace in his manner. She was minded to come closer in intimacy, for in these recent days, before and just after our wedding, a happy confidence seemed to possess her. Self-defense and the hardness it has to carry with it were necessary to her no longer. She reached out more freely for love and friendship, and broke the bounds of that thoughtful isolation which had so often served to keep the woman herself apart from all about her. She was not on guard now. That was the meaning of the change which had come over her. Not on guard and not fighting. After dinner she drew a low stool up beside the old man's big armchair before the fire, and sat down beside him, laying one arm across his knees. I sat smoking on the other side of the hearth. Sir Paget laid his hand on hers for a moment, as though to welcome her bodily presence thus in touch with him. "You'll be wondering how it happened," she began, "and Julius won't have been able to tell you. Probably it never occurred to him to try, though I suppose he's told you all the actual happenings, the outward things, I mean, you know. It was at St. Maxime that we began to be we to one another. I knew it in him then, perhaps sooner than he did. But I don't know. He's still rather secretive about himself, though intolerably inquisitive about other people. But I did know it in him, and I searched and found it in myself. Not love then, but a feeling of partnership, of alliance. I was very lonely then. Well, I can stand that. I was standing it. And I could have gone on. Perhaps. I wonder if I could. No, not after I found out about Arsenio's taking that money. That would have broken me, if it hadn't been for St. Maxime." She paused for a moment. When she spoke again, she addressed me, on the other side of the fireplace. "You went away for a long while. But you remembered and you wrote. I'm not a letter writer, and that was really the reason I didn't answer. I have to be with people, to feel them, if I'm to talk with them to any purpose, to ask them questions and get answers, even though they don't say anything." I saw her fingers bend in a light pressure on old Sir Paget's knee. "I should have sounded stupid in my letters, or said too much. Because the only thing was to say nothing about it, wasn't it? You knew that as well as I did, didn't you? If once we had talked, in letters or when you came back—" "I did nearly talk when you suddenly appeared there on the piazza at Venice. It was pretty nearly as good as a declaration, wasn't it, Julius?" She gave a low, merry laugh. But then her eyes wandered from my face to the blaze of the fire, and took on their self-questioning look. "I think it's rare to be able to see the humor of things all by yourself. I mean, of course, of close things. Things very dear to you, things that hurt, although they're really funny. You want a sympathizer, somebody to laugh with. Oh, well, it goes deeper than that. You want to feel that there's another world outside the miserable little one you're living in. Outside it, different from it. A place where you yourself can be different from the sort of creature which the life you're leading forces you to be. At least unless you're a saint, I suppose, and I never was that. You want a city of refuge for your heart, don't you, Sir Paget? For your heart, and your feelings, yes, and your humor. For everything that you are, or that you've got, and want to go on being or having. Because the worst thing that anybody or any state of things can do to you or threaten you with is the destruction of yourself, whether it's done by assault or by starvation. In the world I lived in, the actual one, as it had come to be for Arsenio and me, I was done for. There was hardly anything left of me. She suddenly turned her face up to Sir Paget with a murmur of laughter. It was like the Cheshire Cat. Nothing left but a grin and claws. A grin for his antics, claws to protect myself. That's what I had come to in my own world, the little world of Arsenio and me. Claws and a grin. Wasn't I, Julius? I would not hear your enemy say so, but... You know it's true. I knew at the time that you felt it, but I couldn't alter myself. Well, I told you something about it at Venice, trying to change, not succeeding. Even his love for me had become one more offense in him, and that was bad. The only thing that carried me through was the other world you gave me, outside my own, where you were, where he wasn't, though we looked at him from it, and had to, where I could take refuge. She went on slowly, reflectively, as though she were compelled reluctantly to render an account to herself. I have escaped. I have gained my city of refuge, but I bear the marks of my imprisonment, even as my hands here bear the marks of my work, of my sewing and washing and ironing. I'm marked and scarred. Sir Paget laid his hand on hers again. We keep a salve for those wounds at Cragsfoot, he said gently. We've stored it up abundantly for you, Lucinda. She turned to him, now clasping his arms with her hands. Yet I put you to shame. I betrayed you. I was false. Oh, and cruel to Waldo. For the first time in all my knowledge of her, I saw tears running down her cheeks. Sir Paget took her hands into his and kissed her upturned face. Waldo's as happy as a king, or at least a prince consort, he said, smiling, though I think that his voice shook a little. And since it's an evening of penitence and confession, I'll make my confession too. I've always been a bit of a traitor, of a rebel myself. You know it well enough, Julius. He smiled. Sitting here, under the sway of Briarmount, I'm afraid that I have, before now, drunk a silent toast to the Queen over the water, because I remembered you in old days, my dear. The mention of Briarmount brought the smiles back to Lucinda's face. She rose from her stool and stood on the hearthrug between us, looking from one to the other. She gave a defiant toss of her fair head. Guilty, my lords, I can't abide her, and I'm glad, yes I am, that she's not here at Cragsfoot. Moreover, she has retreated even from Briarmount before you, chuckled Sir Paget. When I advanced in strength, she always retreated, said Lucinda with another toss. The fact is, I had the least bit more effrontery. I could bluff her, whatever was in my heart. She couldn't bluff me. Reconciliation, I suppose, impossible? Hazarded the diplomatist en retraite, not able to resist the temptation of plying his trade, of getting round the grand implacability. What a feather in his cap it would be. Looking down the vista of years, said Lucinda, now gaily triumphant in her mastery over the pair of us. A thing I used to do, Julius, oftener than I need now. I see two old ladies basking somewhere in the sun, perchance at Villa San Carlo, which I have not up to now visited, though I know the surrounding district. From under their wigs, in old squeaky voices, I thank God for my mortality, murmured old Sir Paget as he looked at her. They're telling one another that they must both of them have been very wonderful, clever, attractive, beautiful, or else they'd never have made so much trouble, and never squabbled so much. And I shouldn't wonder if they said, both of them, that nothing in the whole business was their fault at all. It was only the men who were so silly. But then they made the men silly. What men wouldn't they make silly when they were young and beautiful so long ago? How much of this is Lady Dundrennan, and how much more is you? Mostly me, Julius.
because I have, as I told you, the least bit more effrontery. But her ladyship agrees, and the two old gossips sip their tea and mumble their toast, with all the harmony and happiness of superannuated sinners. I am sure I needn't explain that feeling to men. They knew all about it.
This picture, distant though it is, saps my conception of Lady Dundrennan, I protested. Perhaps of you too. Do you mind if I call you a good hater? A smile hung about her lips, but her voice passed from the gay to the gentle, and the old inward-looking gaze took possession of her eyes. No, I don't mind. I like my hatreds. Even for me, there never failed to be something amusing in them. I wonder if I do myself too much credit in saying something unreal. Did I play parts, like poor Arsenio? But they seemed very real, and they kept my courage up. I suppose it's funny to think that one behaves, well, honorably sometimes, just to spite somebody else. I'm afraid it is so, though. Isn't it, Sir Paget?
The Pharisee in the temple comes somewhere near your notion. She came and sat herself down on the arm of my chair and threw her arm round my neck. Yes, hatreds serve their turn, but they ought to die. Being of the earth, earthy, they ought to, oughtn't they? And they do. Do any of us here hate poor Arsenio now? Suddenly she kissed me. You never did, because you're so ridiculously understanding, and I thank you for that now, because it helped me to try not to try to remember that he loved me, and that he couldn't help being what he was. But where's all my anger gone? Why, you and I often talk of him and enjoy his tricks, don't we? They can't hurt us now. They're just amusing. And we're grateful to the poor man, and don't feel hard to him any more, do we? She fell silent for a moment, and then, with a broader smile, and with one hand uplifted in the air, she said, And so, Sir Paget, very, very dear Sir Paget, I backed myself to make friends with Nina in, well, say 5 years. The prudently calculated audacity of this undertaking made us laugh. And with Waldo, how soon? Asked Sir Paget. Oh, tomorrow. But if I do that, I must take 10 years instead of 5 for Nina. You'd better arrange the timetable in your own way, my dear, Sir Paget admitted discreetly. Now I'll go off to bed and leave you to have a talk together. He rose from his chair and advanced towards her to give her his good-night greeting. Quicker than he was, she met him almost before he had taken a step. Catching his hands in hers, she fell on her knees before him. Have you a blessing left for the sinner that repenteth? For your prodigal daughter? She was not in tears now, nor near them. She was just wonderfully and exultantly coaxing. The old man disengaged his hands, clasped her face with them, turned it up to him, and gallantly kissed it. Your sunshine warms my old bones, he said. I'm glad you're back at Cragsfoot, Lucinda. He turned away quickly and left us. I went to her and raised her from her knees. That's all right, she said, with a tremulous but satisfied little laugh. And I love him even more than I've tried to make him love me. And that's saying a good deal to you, who've seen me practice my wiles. Are the tricks stale to you, Julius? Yes. Try some new ones. Ah, you're cunning. The old ones are, I do believe, good enough for you. The new ones had better be for Nina. In 5 years, Julius, as sure as I live and love you. How do you propose to begin? I asked skeptically. I knew my Nina. I knew Lucinda. It seemed, at the best, a very even bet whether she could bring it off. Lucinda laughed in merry confidence and mockery. Why, by giving her to understand that you make me thoroughly unhappy, of course. How else would you do it? End of chapter 27. Recording by Nick Bulka. End of Lucinda by Anthony Hope.